just with a bit of an introduction, one of the things I was saying is we are going to record this session, so just on time. So if there's anything you don't want us to broadcast or include, just let us know. This is just so we can share the sessions with other people who aren't able to attend, and in the learning that we do after the festival's finished. So yeah, again, really warm welcome to everybody. My name's Helen. I'm one of the directors here at London Funders, and I'm co-hosting this session today with Tanya from 360 Giving, who I'll be passing over to shortly. But I guess, yeah, what we're here, what's this session for? So as you know, this session is part of our Festival of Learning, which is all about sharing learning ideas, inspiring each other, looking at future funding for Londoners. And this session specifically is part of a piece of work that we're doing to look at the funding for advice services across the capital. And some of you have been involved in the project so far. This is an ongoing piece of work, so we're kind of midway through. So we're really looking to you to sort of help us shape this. So this session will be sharing some of the emerging findings from the first stage of this work, which Tanya will talk us through. This is on the kind of quantitative work that we've been doing. But the second part, we really want to kind of open up the discussion and hear from you as funders already funding advice, or those who are interested in advice. So whatever perspective you're coming from, we really welcome your input to help us shape how we can strengthen and make the advice sector more sustainable going forward. It will be a bit interactive, so you've had a health warning. We will be doing some breakouts about halfway through, so please please stick around for that. We've got some some good discussion points that we'd love to get your views on, and it's also an opportunity to connect with others who are interested in this topic. So we'll move on to that a little bit later on. But for now, what I'm going to start doing just before I hand over to Tanya is just give a little bit more background on the advice work that we're doing. So I'm going to start sharing. I've got a couple of slides. The first of which, just open that. Is a quick poll. So bear with us. I'm just going to launch this quick poll just to see who is here. So hopefully you will see a set of questions opening up on your screen just to understand who we are as a group. So what's your organisation's relationship with funding advice in London? Is it the focus of your funding? It's one of many things you fund alongside other themes. You fund organisations providing advice, but it's not an explicit focus for you. You don't fund it, but you're interested, or you're here for another reason that doesn't fit that, in which case something else. So if you can just take a minute to complete the poll, which hopefully you can. Can you see the results, Malena? From that, they're not showing for me, but
yes, they are. Yeah.
Okay, so I might ask you to just read those out. I think as chair, I can't see the findings. So if it looks like people have participated, do you mind just reading that out for us?
Yes. So 13%, which is one person, said that it's the focus of their funding. So advice is the focus of their funding. 25% said advice is a focus for us alongside other themes. 50% said we fund organisations providing advice, but it's not explicit focus for us. No one said that they didn't fund advice, and one person said it's something else. So yeah.
Great. Thanks. So yeah, a bit of a mix in terms of it being, let me see if we can show that. Yeah, a kind of primary focus for you as a funder, or something alongside a much kind of wider portfolio. Okay, thank you for that. So I'm going to move on, hopefully if my slides do. Yeah, to give you a bit more background to the session and why we're here. So as I mentioned at the start, London Funders is midway through a piece of work to look at the funding currently going into I disappeared. Is it back?
You're back.
I'm back. Sorry, everyone. I might just decided to totally crash. I'm going to try that again. There we go. Halfway through a project, I was saying, to map the funding going into welfare advice in London. It's been supported by the GLA, and it feeds into a number of other pieces of work that have been done recently, which some of you will be familiar with, which has looked at different aspects of the advice sector, not just in London. Some of them have looked beyond that. But this is really trying to build on those and fill in some of the gaps about what we don't yet know, and try and provide that kind of up-to-date picture of funding currently going across into services across the capital. Why we're doing that, I think we all share an ambition of trying to create a sustainable, thriving advice sector for Londoners. It's a challenging context. I think we've all seen demand increase. So sorry, this just has crashed again. Apologies, everyone. That's just multiple crashing. I'm going to whiz through this and hand over to Tanya before it has chance to do it again. So yes, I was saying a chance to kind of look at the funding currently going into advice and really try and look at the provision of a future.
So Helen's frozen again. Do you want a hotspot? Yeah. So Helen is going to try and sort it out, but Tanya, maybe we'll hand over to you while she sorts out her tech.
Sure. Do you want to skip forward to the slides on the data? Are we able to do that? No? Do you want me to share my screen? Okay. Just a minute.
Very typical, isn't it, that your tech crashes when you need it to function the most, but hopefully we can sort it out.
Okay. Just to introduce 360 Giving, we support grant makers to publish their data, and then we help people to use that data to improve charitable giving. So we were involved in this project, being able to support with some of the qualitative information. So we were looking at developing a profile of advice organisations, looking at who is funding them, the ecosystem of funding. And we did that through looking at the data available on charities from the Charity Commission. We did use some data from Advice UK and AS UK member lists, Advice Services Alliance, to identify which are the relevant organisations to include in the analysis. And then we also looked at the data on grants published using the 360 Giving data standard. So one of the things about the grants that have been published, it is voluntary. So we don't necessarily have a completely full data set, and that's some of the challenge in terms of understanding this context. So what we found so far in terms of the work that we've done, we looked at the profile of organisations. We identified 334 organisations that were delivering in London. 331 were registered charities. And we segmented them by the type of their organisations and their geographical scope. So the community-based ones include things that are happening in community centres and services aimed at the general population. The community-specific ones were working with serving people with a particular identity or lived experience, such as disabled people or carers, for example. And then we put some of them as major charities. Because although they provide advice, it's a much smaller part of what they do. So that included organisations like Royal British Legion and MenCap, who do provide advice services, but it was when they were included in the other areas, it was just skewing things completely. So that's how we looked at segmenting it. The majority of the organisations we identified operated in a single borough or multiple adjacent boroughs. And you can see here over half worked with people of a specific identity or experience with the 183 of the 334 organisations. And then the majority of the organisations were small. So excluding the major charities and the student unions who don't necessarily provide advice as the most significant thing they do, 74% of them had an income of under £1 million. And actually that's likely to be an underrepresentation of those organisations, because I think the proportion are likely to be even smaller than that. And partly because we were using the Advice UK and the AS UK membership list to support identification of the organisations in the Charity Commission data. What we might be missing is the long tail of community organisations that might be providing advice services, but might not necessarily be members of those organisations. It was actually quite hard to identify. So some of the context, just so you know, is when we looked at the Charity Commission data, there were 10,000 organisations that were operating either directly in London or national organisations that provided advice services. And part of that is there's a lot of organisations that tick every tick box on the Charity Commission register. So even if they might not be providing a high level advice, how they might term their work might include advice in it. And it also goes into some of the advocacy and training and other things that are included in that wider advice. So it wasn't easy to identify the organisations, and London Funders did a great job going through the list of those 10,000 to identify the organisations that we should be including. And then, so looking at them, the organisations, this is the profile of the proportion of income from government. So this is local authorities as well as central government. And you can see that citizens' advice organisations recorded 61% of income from government grants and contracts. And that profile is very different for the different types of organisations. I think this is also a underrepresentation. I think there's probably a higher proportion that are from government contracts, because the smaller organisations don't need to record it on the Charity Commission annual return, because they don't have to fill in that part of the annual return. We don't necessarily have that data. So again, I think this is an underrepresentation. We're looking at about 40% overall in terms of the data that we identified, but I think it's probably higher than that because of what different organisations need to report in their data. So this is the Who Funds With Who. I appreciate it's going to be difficult to read, and I thought I was going to not be showing my screen, so I'll see if I can put it in the chat. So this is a way that you can see where funders have recipients in common. So of this group of the 334 organisations, these are the funders that have at least 5 recipients in common. And so the reason why we did this is because we wanted to look at the kind of ecosystem of the funding. So there aren't many funders that, and when we looked at it separate from this, there aren't many funders that are the only ones funding an organisation. I think that's really important, because when funders look at changing their strategy, it's recognising that that has an impact on the overall ecosystem. If you're either not funding an organisation or increasing funding in an area, what does that mean in terms of the other organisations surrounding that? There's a little bit more on this in terms of the full report. But what I wanted to just highlight is that there were 25 organisations in that sample that received 20 or more grants between 2020 and 23. And that's just in this published data. And they're likely to have received many more grants than that by other funders who either haven't published their data at all or haven't updated it recently. What we found is there were a few funders who hadn't updated their data for a couple of years, which meant that we didn't have the information available. What we found was quite a high volume of smaller and relatively short-term grants in terms of the overall picture of grant making that we found. So if I just skip it, oops, no. So in terms of the overall picture, there were only 9% of the grants in 2020 to 21, which were over 12 months, over a year. And that might be expected due to the pandemic and a lot of emergency funding. But when we looked at the grants that were made in 2022 to 23, it had increased to 26%, which is obviously a substantial increase. But actually, I think the real value is lower than this, because there were a number of community foundations and local authorities that only fund for 1 year, who hadn't published their data for 2022 to 23 yet. So I think this is probably an overestimate, and we've got a lower proportion of grants being for over a year than that. And this is something that where other research that we have done has also highlighted some of these issues. I think particularly for advice work, especially where there are kind of more specialist staff needed, it is really challenging having short-term funding. And even if that funding is renewed each year, the uncertainty makes it difficult to invest in staff development, but also just the sheer amount of time it's taking to manage the fundraising and administering those grants. So there was one organisation that had a turnover of just over £250,000 that had over 20 grants in that period. And that's just quite difficult to manage. And then, so some of the conclusions that we've got so far in terms of the quantitative data, just recognising that it's quite a diverse subsector, both in terms of the nature of the organisations, the size of the organisations, the kind of people that they're supporting. It's characterised by relatively small organisations that are often quite embedded in communities. We found a high number of small or shorter term grants. So there's an opportunity there to look at how collaboration can support that more effectively to overcome some of those issues. And a significant amount of the overall funding to advice organisations is provided by just 3 organisations, so National Lottery Community Fund, City Bridge Foundation, and Trust for London. So I think whilst there is a more diversity in terms of the range of funders when we looked at this advice sector than some of the other areas of work that we've looked at, like infrastructure, it still wasn't many. And especially in terms of having ones that are providing substantial amounts. There were quite a few limitations on the data. I mentioned before, it's difficult to identify advice organisations. We can't disaggregate the expenditure, which is specifically for advice. It's quite hard to see that in the organisation's accounts. So when we're looking at those totals, and there was 280 million of income for the organisations identified in this cohort, but we can't tell how much of that was specifically for advice, even when it's 280 million excluding those large charities. There are some key funders of this work that are not publishing their data, and especially local authorities. So that is really impacting the picture, particularly in London, that there are only a few local authorities that are publishing their data and are publishing it well. There are some funders that are very late in publishing their data for 2022 to 23. So again, that impacts the overall picture and what we're able to tell in terms of potential trends on the data. There's incomplete data on the grant duration, and that impacts the understanding. And the data available doesn't reflect the capacity or the demand for services inevitably, because what we're only looking at is the financial side. So I think there's other analysis that we've done that can also support building the picture, and the report that we mentioned earlier in terms of Access to Justice Foundation that we worked with to look at specialist legal advice funders, although that was national, also told an interesting tale because we were able to look at the time on the data. But also we've done quite a lot of work with IVAR, the Institute for Voluntary Action Research, to look at the impact of those shorter term grants on organisations and what that might mean for how funders could be looking at funding those organisations in a more sustainable and more strategic way. Let me just stop sharing my screen. So hopefully that's provided a bit of an overview of the work, and hopefully Helen is back.
I am back, and apologies. This is always helpful when it crashes multiple times in a session. So thank you, Tanya, for stepping in and starting your presentation. I did manage to catch most of that. So yeah, thank you. And apologies if I misses the bit of context just before we pause for some questions from Tanya, was just to kind of explain how this fitted into the wider piece of work that we're doing, which Tanya may well have touched on, but I think just to emphasize, you know, we know, well, as you said, the limitations of the data that we're able to gather for various reasons. So this is really trying to build that picture. What else do we know about the funding currently going into the advice sector, but also through the next phase, which is the kind of qualitative phase that we're undertaking, is to also try and understand, explore that in more detail, but understand the future picture. So what are the intentions of funders going forward? We've seen shifts in how advice is being funded, some, you know, examples of collaborative funding approaches, different models which are being used. But what do we know going forward so that we can try and look at other opportunities to strengthen it in the future? A couple of very quick points just on definitions as well, because, you know, we had quite a tough brief, I think, for 360 Giving on this, because as you talked about, the coding of how this data is captured and recorded is quite challenging. But just on the note, we've incorporated a very wide definition of advice for this project. So social welfare advice in its broadest sense, which, you know, did present challenges when trying to identify where it is being provided. But I guess just to make emphasize that. And within that, we also deliberately included provision which is both accredited and non-accredited. So as Tanya talked about, this is a huge breadth of organisations, some very specialist targeted providers, alongside a lot of community-based settings where advice might be part of a much wider kind of suite of services that they're offering, or at different stages of that kind of journey through advice. So I guess just to put those two bits out there. And I think for us, we're really keen that we can use this information along with the next phase, which we'll talk to you about, to look at other ways of supporting funders to invest in advice services. I was starting before I crashed to sort of tell you, as Tanya's also touched on, some of the other really interesting bits of research that have been done in the last few years to look both at the wider advice sector, but also some of those different approaches. So we've had some really great projects looking at advice in community settings, various detailed reports on different sections of the advice sector. So I think you mentioned around immigration as an example. There's some mapping work being undertaken at the moment, sort of spearheaded by some of the work across some of the ICS regions within London, looking at what advice provision is there on the ground in community settings. So there's lots of really good stuff going on, and we really want to try and align and build on that with that lens with funders on where we can kind of go forward and support a sort of strategy for London. So apologies again, but Tanya, thank you for sharing that analysis. I wanted to just pause to see if there were any specific questions from anyone for Tanya on either the findings that you've shared, but also some of almost that process of trying to understand the data as well, because I think it's something we've all talked about, trying to have a better picture of advice to see what we're funding, and any other kind of comments or reflections from anyone on that.
I guess recognising that if we want to have better quality information in the future, it will rely on people sharing data more accurately, more regularly, to be able to then take more informed decisions. So we try to do what we could with what was available, but there is an opportunity for us to look at this a bit more strategically about what is the information that will be helpful in the future to inform future strategies, but also even monitoring the effectiveness of this current one that's being looked at.
Brilliant, thanks Tanya. Are there any questions from the group for Tanya, or any kind of reflections on the data that you've seen? Feel free to just unmute. We're small enough to just unmute and dive in. Come off camera. Alex, I can see you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I love these kind of reports, and they're always so interesting to look at. I wondered, Tanya, is there any way of complementing the data that's uploaded to 360 Giving through like FOIs? I imagine like local authorities are providing funding to advise from different departments, and therefore like there's no single person who's responsible for collating that data and uploading it to 360 Giving. Whereas if you did a freedom of information request, I wonder that might be a way of getting data that complements it. I know Justice Together did a freedom of information request on local authority funding for immigration advice, and it was quite amazing how much funding is being given to immigration advice from local authorities.
Yeah, that's been a real challenge in terms of local authorities and the quality of data, and also even just because some things go across different departments, just the challenge in collating that. So Director of Social Change did a freedom of information request just for the total amount of grant making, and was not able to get it for the majority of local authorities. We tried to do a survey of as part of the UK grant making project, which we're going to be launching next month, just again of the total amounts of the local authorities in London, and we actually only had 2 that were able to tell us. I mean, there were a couple that are publishing their data as well, like Hackney, but other than that, it was really difficult because the majority of the local authorities just don't have access to anything that goes across more than one department. It's a lot easier if you can go, if there's a single department, and that might be where justice is slightly easier, but advice might be going across more than one department, which makes it very difficult to then get the information.
Are there particular departments that are more likely to be funding advice that you could do an FOI on? Like, could you do an FOI on all adult social services that are providing advice, or housing departments? Would that give you a more likely response, higher response rate?
Yeah, and I think but it's also about both the quality of the data and the sustainability of that approach. So one of the things that we want to do is actually a project working with all local authorities in London to see, can we get more of them sharing their data? Because we're talking about it for advice now, but actually it will be something else. And for me, there's also something about the interactions between some of the different services. So there are organisations that might be providing like adjacent services that we need to understand how that data interacts. So I think that would be my call of looking at, is there something more that we could do to support local authorities to share their data, share the good practice of those that are, but also having a way to have that data available more sustainably long term and across all different areas, so that we're able to make the most from that.
Thanks, Tanya. There was also a question from Cherry in the chat about government funding. So is there an indication that the share of government funding for the sector is falling, or how we might get that data?
So the central government departments have to publish all of their data, and they've only just published the data for 2022 to 23. We're now analysing that because we need to take out like all of the grants which are not for the sector that they include in their data. So for example, there's £5 billion as a COVID grant to the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, which when we looked at it, we thought, oh, look, there's so much money going. And then we realised no. We're unpicking that at the moment. And so next month we will be producing something which does look at the trends in grant making across every different sector where we've been able to take it from accounts. The one that we haven't been able to do is local authorities. So whilst we have all of central government department and we can unpick that and put it back together in a different way, we don't have that for local authorities. All we have for local authorities is an estimate of the total amount which was developed by Directory of Social Change as a consequence of doing a mixture of FOIs and estimates from other sources of 600 million from local authorities. We don't know what the trend is going to be on that. And so I think that's where it's challenging. We can look at individual organisations that have shared their data to look at overall trends, but I don't think we're going to be able to do that for local authorities as a whole, because not enough of them share their data or even know themselves. I think that's a challenge.
Thanks, Tanya. Okay, if there are any final questions just on the data side, flag it now, because we will otherwise move on, if that's okay.
I have a question.
Yes, sorry, Abby, go ahead.
Tanya, thanks so much for sharing all of that. And I'm wondering if in the process you were uncovering any best practices, because a lot of it that, you know, Claire and I work here at Hackney on, and we are living what you're saying about the challenge of data at local authority level. And that part of that is, what are you doing in the process of? It's hard to go back and add tags that make it easier to pull data. But I'm wondering if you're uncovering any best practices while doing this piece of work.
Yeah, so what we found is that in some areas where you have a group of funders that are who are doing it more collectively, you get a much richer picture. And Hackney is a good example of that, because we've not only got the local authority, but we've also got the CVS and Hackney Giving, however that fits in, also available in the data, and some other local funders. And so I think there is an impact of where you have the depth of funders in a particular area. You're able to then, even if you don't have the full information from some of them, there's enough information to be able to get a more nuanced picture. It is much harder in some of the areas where we know there are massive gaps in terms of which funders are sharing their data. But the data standard itself, in some local authorities, and so we've got an example of a local authority which is outside London, they've actually just found the data standard helpful for them internally, because what they've then been able to say is, if every department shares data in this way, it then takes the pressure off someone having to collate it and then edit it and all of those kind of things. So that's also other things that we can do to look at what is going to be most helpful in terms of an approach for local authorities. And even if it means for the London local authorities, it may be that we can develop some kind of shared categorizations that's going to be relevant to organisations that would then add value above what is in the existing data standard. We're also going to be doing some quality campaigns. So things like the fact that most funders are not recording the duration of the grants is a real issue, because we can't tell if 30,000 is for a year or if it's over 3 years or 5 years, and there's a big difference in that. So I think we're going to be doing some campaigns to encourage people to include more of the voluntary fields. And even some funders are not including charity numbers. That makes a big difference to be able to link the data together.
Thanks, Tanya. And Alex, I think you had a couple of quick clarification ones while we're still on the data. That's fine.
Yeah, I'll be very, very quick. Tanya, I think this was on the slides, but I missed it. When you said Trust for London, City Bridge and National Lottery were kind of three of the bigger funders, was that on number of grants, or was it on volume of grant size? Like, was it the value of grants, or was it number of grants?
It's the total value of the grants.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
But I think there is, and there will be others where what's not clear is because they haven't published data. So for example, London Community Fund hasn't published data for 2 years. So
Yeah.
that may have been up there. What we can't tell is, have they continued to fund those organisations since the pandemic? Because the data we're looking at was from 2020 to 2023. Have they continued? We've only got 1 year's worth. In the report, we've got a full table, which has got a list of all of the funders with the number of grants they've made and to that cohort of organisations.
Yeah, brilliant. And then just a very quick follow-up, but actually, I think it's more for you, Abby. Do you know, do local authorities all use the same database to record their data, or is every local authority using different databases? Tanya's not, I think I've got the answer.
You'll be surprised at how many we find don't have a database,
Right.
if I'm going to be honest.
Thank you. Okay, there's one final question from Matt, which I think is a kind of building on Cherry's question earlier in terms of the trend with trusts and foundations funding advice. And I think, well, I'll hand over to Tanya to explain before I chip in. But I think as well, second part of the question is it an outlier compared to other funding priorities? So I think, Matt, yeah, it's that sort of shift that we're seeing with advice funding reflective of other themes.
So in terms of a trend in grant making overall from trusts and foundations, we are just unpicking the data that will have that available next month. But in terms of specifically for advice, the challenges are that there are a number where we are missing the data. So it's quite hard to compare like for like. What we could do is compare those funders that have published data for all 3 years to see if there's a trend. But there's still the challenge then of the duration of the grants, because I think that more of the ones in 2020 were for 1 year. And although we have seen a slight increase in the number of 2 and 3 year grants, if it isn't recorded in the structured data, it's hard to read the trend in that.
Great, thank you. Okay, we've got about 15, just over 15 minutes left, and we'd really welcome your input onto the sort of qualitative phase of the project. So building on the analysis that 360 have given, that's all contributing to this wider picture of what we know about the funding going into advice services across London. What we'd like to do is explore some of the issues that which we're hearing about, both from the analysis, but also from speaking to funders. So Sarah, my colleague from London Funders, has been doing some interviews with funders over the last couple of weeks. We've got some more scheduled in to kind of hear from them about their current approaches. But we'd also like to do some kind of more in-depth case studies as well, looking at some of the practice or approaches within sorts of funding collaborations, as an example, which people feel, this is what we could learn on, which we could build on, which we could replicate in other areas. So all of the things that we don't yet know, what are the gaps? What could we try and utilize this next phase of the research for? So we have some questions for you, which I am not going to attempt to share the screen because I will jinx it. But we're going to break into 2 groups. We'll put you in random breakout groups if that's okay. There are 3 questions we'd like to ask you, which I'll read out and then we'll pop in the chat. The first is really trying to get at that, like what do we not know about the advice funding landscape in London? So if there is one thing you could understand better, what would it be? The second, I guess, is building on Abby's point there. Are there specific models or approaches that either you're funding or you've come across that we could explore further in the qualitative phase. So what's really excited you or inspired you, or you've heard that they're doing in another place that we could, or London could try and implement around advice? And again, we're using the broad definition of advice in that. And the final one, if we have time, is kind of what else is needed to create a thriving advice sector in London and how our funding could support that. So the 3 questions are in the chat now. We have done a Jamboard, which you're welcome to use. You don't have to. We can just write some notes. That's more there because I know some people find it helpful to write thoughts down. So an optional Jamboard and 3 questions and about 12 minutes. So that's the challenge we're setting you. Milena, are you okay to put us into groups? And myself, Tanya and Sarah will be around to sort of remind you of the questions if needed. So yeah, hopefully you'll get a thing flash up on your screen now to join one of those rooms. Bit brutal cutting off there in my group, so apologies, Alex. You were mid-flow. I might have to catch you in the office next time you're here. Thank you, everyone. As ever, the breakouts never seem to give us enough time, but hopefully you got some discussion. Instead of kind of feeding back everything, because we've been taking some notes, I just wondered if there were any kind of final reflections or thoughts that we can do with this work as well. So I've talked about, we want to use this for informing future kind of funding within our membership, but also quite a lot of people have talked about kind of, the influencing, I suppose, capacity with this as well. Speaking to other funders, we've had an interesting discussion now around kind of the local authority side of things, in terms of the data, but also the scale of the sort of savings that will need to be made in the future. We'll probably need to be doing things differently. So I just wondered any kind of final thoughts that anyone wants to throw into the mix, or things that have really sort of struck you that we can look at in this work. Just come, if you want to just come off mute and throw anything into the pot.
I'll just add, like what we were talking about in our breakout room. I think it's that recognition that we need to kind of look at things maybe in a more holistic way, and that advice organisations sit within an ecosystem, which is demonstrated by some of the data and the increased number of like community-based organisations offering advice, probably out of a need that they've seen within the communities that they're working in. I think it'll be interesting. I know we can't necessarily get that from the data, but I think there's something about many of these organisations now working in partnerships or in networks, and to reach people that are most in need. It would be really useful for us to understand more kind of the different interventions and ways of working. Yeah. So we can continue to support that, as opposed to maybe just kind of funding an organisation in isolation. As funders, we have a tendency to do that. How do we come together and think more holistically around the ecosystem?
Thanks, Shabana. And thanks, Abby. I know a couple of people, we will wrap up in a minute. I know people have got meetings to get to. Thank you, Shabana. Yeah, totally agree. I think we're seeing more of that community-based response, and how we can support that going forward. Okay, I will try and be a chair that sticks to the time. And apologies again for the technical laptop crashing. That was not on the plan. So thank you for bearing with us during that. And sorry if it was a little bit disruptive from our end, but thank you to Tanya. Just to say, we'll be reaching out if you kind of want to have another conversation around advice. We are all ears. We're really keen to speak to people, and I know a lot of you have already lined up a conversation with Sarah, which is great. Tanya and I will be sort of liaising on the data side and kind of pulling all of that together with the qualitative work over the next month or so. But yeah, do reach out. We're really keen to have that conversation. And if you do come across things that catch your attention, that you've heard other funders are doing in other places, that might be something we can look at in the case studies, we're really keen to hear those examples as well. So yeah, I'm going to wrap up. Thanks again, everybody. And yeah, do join us for any final sessions of the Festival of Learning in the next day or two, and particularly Thursdays in person closing session in central London, where we'll have the time to talk in person, free of the fear of technical hitches. So yeah, thanks everybody for your input. Thanks, Tanya, and see you all soon.